All right. Hi, everybody. You're at using Prow for testing outside of K8s. If you're not here for that, you're in the wrong room, but you feel free to stay. My name is Matt Landis. I'm an engineer at AWS on EKS. I've been at Amazon for about 4 years, just over 4 years now, and I've been on EKS for approaching a year and a half. So we're going to talk about what Prow is and how you can look at using it for your testing needs, if it fits. So, there we go. All right, so what is Prow? Just curious, how many people here have heard of Prow? That's a good sign. How many people here have either contributed to Prow itself or written test cases for the upstream Prow? All right, a few lists. How many people here are running their own Prow cluster? All right, we have a few. Some that I expected. Yeah, so what is Prow? It's a Kubernetes-based CI/CD system, which could mean a whole lot of things. The core of it is it will respond to events that can come from multiple places, and it will run jobs and then report the status of those jobs to other services. And it's in our Kubernetes way, it is a microservice architecture, which means we can replace pieces that don't do what we need or we need to do something else. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go in. But the core is, it gives you what you need to have a CI/CD system, right? You have an event that happens, you got a pull request or a commit that happens, a merge, and you need to test it. And then it runs the job and reports the results. So if you jump into the Getting Started guide and run the YAML on your cluster, you're going to get something that looks a little bit like this. Yeah, so that's a lot of things. And they all do various jobs that we need. And so we're going to jump in kind of where you start when you have this Getting Started cluster, which is the first thing that's going to trip me up is how to correctly say this word. Horologium, is that, I got it, maybe, close enough. So Horologium is responsible for running scheduled periodic jobs within a Prow cluster. And so when you start up your test cluster, you're going to have a deployment for Horologium. I'm just going to stop saying that word. And it's going to be sitting there running, and it reads its config out of the config map. And there's a YAML in there that has a periodic job that's going to run every 10 minutes and use a Alpine container to print out the date. It's fairly simple. And when you're coming from this, you can put any container you want there and run anything you want. So if you have a container that is a test that can be put into a container, you can now run it on a periodic schedule. And so all Horologium does is create a Prow job entry and stick it in the CRD. That's it. It's done. So what do we do from here? From here, we're going to have Plank, which is kind of the core of running the jobs within a Prow cluster. And Plank is going to it's sitting there watching on changes to the CRD. And it's going to pick this up and execute the job and manage the lifecycle of it. It's looking for jobs that were created by Prow. So if we go back to this thing that's probably too small to actually see, if my slides are going backwards, there's a little created by Prow in there, a true. That's good. And the other thing it looks for is the agent Kubernetes. So if it agents Kubernetes, that means it is a Kubernetes job and can be run on the Kubernetes cluster. It's going to start the job. It's going to watch it and update the state. And the other thing it'll do if you're running pre-submit jobs is it detects if there has been a change, right? So it kicked off a pre-submit job for my PR. I noticed that I had a bug in it. I go and update my PR. There's been a new commit. And now it needs to run the new pre-submit job. So it's going to watch for that and detect that the first job is no longer valid and terminate that so we're not wasting those resources and waiting for that to report. Yeah, so it appears my highlighting disappeared. It updates the state to pending of the job. So when it's triggered by Horologium, it has a state of triggered. It gets updated to pending. It sets some flags. and then it creates a pod that it's going to sit and monitor for completion or termination, hopefully completion with an exit status of 1 or 0, not 1. 1's bad. Yeah, so it's also going to insert some environmental variables for us there, like the build number, the job name. And so now we have a job that's running, and we want to look at it, find out what happened. It doesn't really help us if we can't see what's going on. And so Deck is going to give us a view of current and recent Prow jobs. This is not a forever view, so if you need a longer-term view of what test execution is, you need to go somewhere else, and there's some things that will help with that later on. If you're using them, particularly in upstream, there's also help for any of the plugins or commands that you can execute, and we'll cover those a little bit later. And then the status of any merge automation tied, which again we'll talk about a little bit later. And then there's a nice little PR dashboard for authors, but for our little cron job, we get something that looks a little bit like this, right? We've executed a lot recently. You'll notice that the time there's a little bit tighter than 10 minutes because I wanted a few more entries on my dashboard and I didn't want to wait 40 minutes. So yeah, you can see what's passed. You get a little red mark there if you've got jobs failing, and so you can get a quick view of what is my recent history. You can filter by different job names and what is the state of the job. And so now we've been running this, and we've been running it for a long time. And if you let it run forever, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of CRDs floating around, and potentially some pods that haven't been deleted. And that's where Syncer comes in. Syncer is kind of the cleanup. So it deletes any completed Prow jobs from the CRD. After whatever the designated time frame is, right? You want to keep them around for a while so you have that view, but I probably don't want to look at my stuff from 6 months ago or let that kill my cluster's performance because I got a CRD with 400,000 entries. But it does, one key thing it does is keep around the most recent periodic job because it needs to know when the last time it ran was to kick off the next one, right? If I end up restarting Herolgium, it's going to lose that state, and if you've got a job that's supposed to run every 10 minutes and you've deleted it, it doesn't know that it was triggered, so it'll run it again immediately. It also cleans up any old pods that have been floating around. So that's kind of where you're at and what you end up using immediately. There's a little bit more configuration that needs to be done if you follow the Getting Started guide, and that's going to be setting up Hook. But so far, for what we've been doing internally, these are the components that we've made the most use of. And then you get into Hook. Hook, in my opinion, is probably one of the coolest things about Prow. And that's its ability to respond to these GitHub events and how modular it is with plugins. There's tons of plugins, and we're going to go over a few of those here in a little bit. And it also supports external plugins. So it's not just the stuff that's been baked in and checked into the main upstream repository that you can use. If you want to do something that supports, as long as you implement the interface that is a GitHub hook call, right, the message you would get from GitHub, you can respond to these events and have them interact with your Prow cluster. So if you've got some internal build system that you need to do something, you can now integrate with that, or some auditing system. Whatever it is, you can respond to these GitHub events. And so if you look at the plugins.yaml, there's a whole bunch of them up there. Some of them, these are the ones that apply to all Kubernetes, all repositories in the Kubernetes org, if you look at the definition file. And there's some really important stuff in there, like CLA. Everybody has to sign the CLA before you can do anything to any of the Kubernetes repositories. LGTM, and then our favorites like dog and cat. So those need more usage, by the way. I haven't seen a lot of dogs on at least PRs I've looked at recently. And then you can also apply, so you get this hierarchical structure and how you can define plugins, right? So we've decided that everybody needs the CLA, so it needs to be on all Kubernetes repositories. But you may want other plugins to only apply to your sub-repository. So if you're a Kubernetes cloud provider AWS, we have things like the welcome message and the trigger, which is on almost most repositories. You'll see that one on, which is responsible for triggering the jobs. Updates to milestones, labels for owners. Yeah, so you can kind of have a hierarchical thing where You can ensure that everybody in your organization is using the stuff that you require for all of your GitHub repositories, and then allow some flexibility in various teams on what they want to use. So after we've run all the tests and we've got all the LGTMs and the approvals, it needs to be merged. And that's where Tide comes in. I have not done anything with Tide on our side. I think Tide is amazing, how quickly it can merge PRs. Thank you to all those people who put that out there. I've heard some impressive numbers on the last, when the last release was unblocked, on how quickly it was able to clear the PR backlog. Yeah, so it retests everything that's been done. So it batches up a bunch of PRs and retests it against the current head. And if everything passes, it's going to go ahead and merge our changes in. So we don't have to do that by hand. Yay. So that is kind of where you're at with what is Prow. Some things that I've seen recently that I did not put on the slides. And kind of an extension point is, we talked about Hook, and that only does GitHub-style hooks, or GitHub Hook-style messages. I know recently Garrett was checked in, so we have support for Garrett. And I'd like to see a lot of, there's been some talk about doing work where we make these interfaces a little bit more generic so we can reuse some of these plugins and other features to apply to more source control systems. I know I recently saw somebody on Slack ask for, can we do Bitbucket? Or can we do GitLab? And I think that the core of Prow is there, that it'd be great if we could extend this beyond this. So now that we have a little bit of background on what Prow is, I'm going to talk about kind of where we started with it at EKS and what we're using it for and where I'd like to go from here. So in the beginning, so Bob comes up to me and says, hey, Matt, we need to know if we're passing conformance or not. So I say, OK, I'm going to dig in and figure out what does conformance mean. I hadn't heard about conformance before. This is the first time I'd heard about it. So figure out, we need to run Sonobuoy and make sure the results match what they're supposed to, and submit that to the CNCF and get our little stamp of approval. So I did a one-off and said, OK, yes, Bob, we're passing. He's like, OK, we need to make sure we don't break. So OK, how do we want to run this? What is the community using for continuous jobs like this? And that's when I found Prow. So I started looking at Prow more and said, it seems like it does what we want to do, plus there's a lot of other tests that are already baked into this that we can look at leveraging as we go forward, not reinvent the wheel. Kubernetes is using this. Let's build on top of it and see where we can go. So when we started out, we had one Prow job. There was a periodic that ran every 2 hours that said, does our beta environment pass conformance? And so the conformance tests take, an hour or so to run. So a 2-hour interval seemed like a good idea to kind of get that cycle going. Except that now you're 2 hours behind if you break anything, and sometimes there's a flake in the test somewhere, and so you have to wait another 2 hours to figure out, was it a flake or was it actually something that broke? So we made beta conformance fast, and so we just ran the parallel tests. We stripped out the serial stuff, said we can find out if that breaks later. If we run the stuff in parallel, the tests, you can run them in like 5 to 10 minutes. Much, much better iteration. And so that's what we went with for a while, and we were getting ready to launch. And said, now we should run tests in our production environments. We know beta's working well, everything's together, but it'd be nice to have a deeper signal on our production environments. So we started running conformance on the 2 regions we launched with, US West 2 and US East 1. And so now we're at 6 jobs. And so this config file is starting to grow. And then we verified and announced we had GPU support. So now we have 9 jobs that are running periodically. And the file's growing, and every time we want to change an AMI ID that we launched these jobs with, now I have to edit 9 places instead of 1 per region. And then we have HPA support. Now we're at 12 jobs. And this is just going to continue to grow as we launch EU West 1. I got 16 jobs. And so what we looked at doing was using Helm to render these templates, right? We want to run a lot of these jobs across all of our regions at some interval, just to have some signal to make sure stuff's not going wrong. We test very heavily in beta, and the first regions you push out, you tend to test heavily, but it's nice to have that check mark that stuff is going well across the board. And so we wrote a template for Helm. We're not using Helm to deploy, we're just using it to render the YAML file and then apply that to Prow and update the config. So that made launching US East 2, much simpler. We added a US East 2 to the list of regions, and now we have jobs running in US East 2 for all of our jobs. And so there is one little thing that I kind of lied about going through this is when we were running our fast jobs, we wanted to run them more frequently, and so that means we created 4 entries for the fast jobs 1, 2, 3, and 4, because Prow currently, PR incoming, doesn't support concurrent periodic jobs, right? So if you have a periodic job and you say, I want to run this every 5 minutes and it takes an hour to run, it's actually going to run every hour. It will wait for the previous job to complete. So that's why we had 4 jobs running. And so I did a little bit of digging and figured out that it doesn't take too much work to allow Prow to run periodic jobs every 10 minutes. Prow currently in Hierarchical ignores max concurrency. It just says if there is a job running, don't run anything. So we have a PR open that's kind of debating what the default behavior should be. For pre-submit jobs, max concurrency defaults to 0, which means infinite. For periodic jobs, currently the default is ignore this thing and treat it as 1. So we're trying to figure out what the right use case is there. If you have any opinions, come on and jump on the PR. But I think we're getting close to a resolution on that and how to handle that. But now we can just say every 10 minutes run it, and if the job takes an hour, we'll still have that signal of that started every 10 minutes. So we get a much better, it worked better with our monitoring too, so that it made monitors easier to reason about, right? We know we have something happening every 10 minutes, so when we set up our alarms to trigger if stuff starts failing, we can say, okay, we should have this many jobs finishing in a window, and write our alarms appropriately, as opposed to trying to say, oh, we have jobs 1 through 4, and if we restart the Prow cluster, then they're all going to get scheduled at the same time, which means we really don't have something starting every 5 minutes like we were kind of hoping for, and it gets kind of messy. Yeah, so that's currently kind of where we're sitting at. We haven't gotten into triggering things other than periodics, and using the dashboard to kind of give us, or using Deck to give us a dashboard into our recent history and our logs. But where are we going from here? One thing I'd like to see is code commit integration. We have some of our code that we build in code commit, and I would love to be able to trigger off of that. So there's been, as I mentioned earlier, there's been Garrett recently has support, and there's been some discussion of how to write the right interfaces to allow things to be reused across plugins. You don't want to have to rewrite /cat for every single provider that we have. I would like to see us start working towards that. I'd love to work with our internal pipelines and code review systems. That's a little bit more hairy. I've started those conversations, and if I get something that's demoable, I will hopefully have something to show you next year, but that's a little bit of a tougher sell, right? There's a lot of other tools that have been built, and if we can't get Prow into those systems, I'd like to take some of the things that we have in Prow and convince the team that those features are worth having in our systems. So there are things that we'd like to see added. And then last is I'd like to see us leverage some more of the infra components. We're currently not using Spyglass to render things. I kind of drop everything in an S3 bucket, and you get to go dig it out yourself. So there's a few things there I'd like to integrate. And then Test Grid is currently, from my understanding, kind of being ripped out of its dependency on Google infrastructure, but that's kind of a up in the air. They're asking for use cases and justification, and I'm saying I want Test Grid so that I don't have to write something to display all of this history. So I'd like to talk to the Test Grid group after this. Other places we're going. So I was hoping to have this done and demoed before I was up here on stage, and we're not quite there yet. So we have the AWS VPC CNI plugin that resides in our AWS GitHub account. And I'm currently working on setting up a Prow cluster to run builds and integration tests and end-to-end for our CNI plugin. So standing up clusters both on using kops and using EKS, applying the new version of the plugin as a pre-submit, running the tests and verifying that we have a good commit. Because right now, it takes a little bit of work to verify all of this without Prow. We also have the Authenticator plugin, which is actually in SIG testing, so this one's a little bit easier. I don't have to stand up, or is in Kubernetes SIGs. I don't have to stand up my own Prow cluster. I can just move it into the Kubernetes cluster. But when we started off, we were not in Kubernetes SIGs. We were in, it was in Heptio's account. And so we were using Travis for the integration there. So I'd like to see that moved so we can have all of the other cool things that we like from Prow. And this one, I think, is something, I think we'll be the first ones to try something like this with Prow, and that is our AMI build. We vend an AMI kind of as a, here's one to get you started out of the box, which we build using Packer, and that's all open sourced. So, and it's on GitHub, so people are sending us pull requests, and I would like to see us try and to build and test the AMI as a pre-submit from using Prow. And so that's a little bit more of a, I think, a new use case. I mean, is anybody here building AMIs using Prow and testing them? So, yes, good to be the first one to do it. Yeah, so that's kind of the end of where we're at with Prow. There's just a few other things I wanted to hit on. I just found out yesterday that EKS has put AWS has put up the container roadmap. So I'm hoping some of these things that we'd like to build out can kind of make it onto the roadmap. But other things that you may be looking for from EKS are showing up there as coming soon. Things like 111 and region launches. We're hiring. I think they make me put that up there, or else I don't get to come and talk. And lastly, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who's kind of put the work into getting Prow to where it's at and helping me get started on it. I think there's been a lot of updates to the documentation in the last 6 months. When I started looking at it, there were some questions that needed to be asked to figure out the right way to get stuff going. CRD, RBAC was not in yet. The RBAC stuff wasn't in the YAML files. So thanks to this whole SIG testing group on what they put together and all the help they provided. So, sorry, I'm looking for, nope, he's not here. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I'm not gonna take questions up here, but I will be available outside if anybody has any questions. Feel free to come by and talk to me. I'll also be over at the AWS booth tomorrow morning. I think I have the early shift, so. Thank you.